Chapter 7. Among the Savages. The flat-topped rock rose up from the yellow, dusty plain of a valley through which ran a river between high, steep banks. On the top of this rock was the Indian village of Malpais. Block above block, each story smaller than the one below, the tall houses rose in great stone steps into the blue sky. At their feet lay an untidy group of low buildings, and on three sides the tall rocks fell straight down into the plain. A few columns of smoke rose into the still air and were lost. "Strange," said Lenina. "Very strange." That was what she called anything that did not please her. "I don't like it. And I don't like that man." She pointed to the Indian guide who had been appointed to take them up to the village. He clearly did not like them either. Even the back of the man, as he walked along, seemed to express his hatred of them. "Besides," she lowered her voice, "he smells." Bernard did not attempt to deny it. They walked on. Suddenly it seemed as though the whole air had come alive and was beating with the tireless movement of blood. Up there, in Malpais, the drums were being beaten. Their feet began to obey the beat of that mysterious heart. They walked more quickly. Their path led them to the foot of the rock. Its sides rose above them like a great tower, 90 meters to the top. "I wish we could have brought the plane," said Lenina, looking up with dislike at the blank rock face. "I hate walking, and you feel so small when you're on the ground at the bottom of a hill." They walked along for a time in the shadow of the rock, turned a corner, and there, in a dry channel worn away by the water in former times, was the way up. They climbed. It was a very steep path that went from side to side of the channel. Sometimes the drums were almost silent. At others, they seemed to be beating only just round the corner. When they were halfway up, a large bird flew past so close to them that they felt the cold wind from his wings on their faces. In a crack in the rock lay a pile of bones. It was all frighteningly strange, and the Indian smelt stronger and stronger. They emerged at last from the channel into the full sunlight. The top of the rock was a flat platform of stone. "Like the Charing Tea Tower," said Lenina, comforting herself with the memory of something familiar and safe. But she was not allowed to enjoy this comforting comparison for long. The sound of soft footsteps made them turn round. Naked from throat to waist, their dark brown bodies painted with white lines, "like clay tennis courts," Lenina was later to explain. Their faces wild, not human, painted red, black, and yellow. Two Indians came running along the path. Fox fur and pieces of red cloth and birds' feathers were twisted into their black hair. Great, brightly coloured headdresses rose above their faces. With every step they took, their silver jewellery shook, and the bones and coloured stones in their necklaces knocked against each other. They came on without a word, running quietly in their animal skin shoes. One of them was holding a feather brush. The other carried, in each hand, what looked at a distance like 3 or 4 pieces of thick rope. One of the ropes moved and twisted, and suddenly Lenina saw that they were snakes. The men came nearer and nearer. Their dark eyes looked at her, but without the smallest sign that they had seen her or were aware of her existence. The twisting snake hung still again with the rest. The men passed. "I don't like it," Lenina said. "I don't like it." She liked even less what she found at the entrance to the village, where their guide had left them while he went inside for instructions. The dirt, to start with, the piles of rubbish, the dust, the dogs, the flies. Her face showed how disgusting she found it. She held her hand to her nose. "But how can they live like this?" she cried, hardly able to believe her own eyes. "They've been doing it for the last 5,000 or 6,000 years," said Bernard. "So I suppose they must be used to it by now." "But cleanliness is next to fordliness," she insisted. "Yes, and civilization is sterilization," Bernard went on with a little smile. "But these people have never heard of our Ford, and they aren't civilized, so there's no point in—" "Oh!" She held his arm. "Look!" An almost naked Indian was very slowly climbing down the ladder from the first floor of one of the houses, with the trembling carefulness of extreme old age. His face was deeply lined and black. The toothless mouth had fallen in. At the corners of the lips and on each side of the chin, a few long hairs shone almost white against the dark skin. The long, untidy hair hung down in grey threads around his face. His body was bent, nothing but skin and bone. Very slowly he came down, pausing at each step before he placed a foot carefully on the one below. "What's the matter with him?" whispered Lenina. Her eyes were wide with horror and shock. "He's old, that's all," Bernard answered as carelessly as he could. He too was shocked, but he made an effort to seem unmoved. "Old?" she repeated. "But the director's old. Lots of people are old. They're not like that." "That's because we don't allow them to be like that. We preserve them from diseases. We keep their bodies in good condition by scientific treatment. We give them young blood at regular intervals. We keep their body systems working perfectly. So of course they don't look like that. Partly," he added, "because most of them die long before they reach this old creature's age. Youth almost perfectly preserved till 60, and then, crack, the end." But Lenina was not listening. She was watching the old man. Slowly, slowly he came down. His feet touched the ground. He turned. His deep sunken eyes were still extraordinarily bright. They looked at her for a long moment without expression, without surprise, as though she had not been there at all. Then, slowly, with bent back, the old man walked painfully past them and was gone. "But it's terrible," Lenina whispered. "It's awful. We ought not to have come here." She felt in her pocket for her soma, only to discover that by some mistake she had left the bottle down at the rest house. Bernard's pockets were also empty. Lenina was left to face the horrors of Malpais unaided. They came crowding in on her. The sight of two young women giving their breasts to their babies made her redden and turn away her face. She had never seen anything so shocking in all her life. And what made it worse was that, instead of pretending to take no notice of it, Bernard kept on making open remarks about this disgustingly animal scene. He went out of his way to show how strong and individual he was. At this moment their guide came back and, making a sign to them to follow, led the way down a narrow street between the houses. A dead dog was lying on a rubbish pile. A woman with a badly swollen neck was combing the dirt from the hair of a small girl. Their guide stopped at the foot of a ladder, then pointed upwards and forwards. They obeyed the sign, climbed the ladder, and walked through a doorway at the top into a long, narrow room, rather dark and smelling of cooked fat and dirty clothes. At the further end of the room was another doorway, through which came a beam of sunlight and the noise, very loud and close, of the drums. They went through the door and found themselves outside again. Below them, shut in by the tall houses, was the village square, crowded with Indians. Bright cloths and feathers in black hair and jewels and dark skins shining in the sun. Lenina put her hand to her nose. In the open space in the centre of the square were two circular platforms of bricks and beaten clay. The roofs, it was clear, of underground chambers. For in the centre of each platform was an open lid, with a ladder coming up from the lower darkness. A sound of pipe playing came up from below and was almost lost in the steady beat of the drums. Lenina liked the drums. Shutting her eyes, she listened to their soft, repeated thunder, but she opened them again at a sudden burst of singing, hundreds of male voices crying out loudly together. A few long notes and silence, then the women's answer, thin and high. Then again the drums, and once more the deep, savage cries of the men. Suddenly there came up from those round underground chambers a frightening band of strange beings. Wearing ugly masks or with faces painted so that they looked like nothing human, they circled in a strange dance round the square. Round and round again, singing as they went, round and round, each time a little faster, and the beat of the drums grew quicker, so that it was like fevered blood in the ears, and the crowd began to sing with the dancers, louder and louder. And first one woman screamed, and then another, and another, as though they were being killed. And then suddenly the leader of the dancers left the circle, ran to a big wooden chest which was standing at one end of the square, raised the lid, and pulled out a pair of black snakes. A great cry went up from the crowd, and all the other dancers ran towards him with their hands stretched out. He threw the snakes to those who arrived first, then put his hands into the chest and drew out more. And then the dance began again, to a different beat. Round they went with their snakes, twisting and turning their bodies as if they were snakes themselves. Round and round. Then the leader gave a signal and, one after the other, all the snakes were thrown down in the middle of the square. An old man came up from underground and scattered seeds over them, and from the other chamber came a woman and threw water over them from a black bottle. Then the old man lifted his hand and, suddenly, there was absolute silence. The drums stopped beating. Life seemed to have come to an end. The old man pointed to the two entrances to the lower world, and slowly, raised by hands from below, there came up from the one a painted image of a large bird, from the other that of a man, naked and nailed to a cross. The old man struck his left hand with his right. Naked, except for a white cotton cloth round his waist, a boy of about 18 stepped out of the crowd and stood before him, his hands crossed over his chest, his head bent forward. The old man made the sign of the cross over him and turned away. Slowly, the boy began to walk round the twisting pile of snakes. From among the dancers, a tall man, wearing the mask of a mountain lion and holding in his hand a leather whip, advanced towards him. The boy moved on as though he had not noticed the other's existence. The lion man raised his whip. There was a long pause, then a quick movement, then the whistle of the whip through the air and the loud, flat sound of the blow falling on flesh. The boy's body trembled, but he made no sound. He walked on at the same slow, steady pace. The whip struck again, and at every blow at first a low cry, and then a deep shout went up from the crowd. The boy walked on. Twice, 3 times, 4 times he went round the pile of snakes. The blood was streaming. 5 times round, 6 times round. Suddenly, Lenina covered her face with her hands and began to cry. "Oh, stop them! Stop them!" she begged. But the whip fell and fell without pity. 7 times round. Then suddenly the boy fell forward onto his face, still without a sound. Bending over him, the old man touched his back with a long white feather, held it up for a moment, red with blood, for the people to see, then shook it 3 times over the snakes. A few drops fell, and suddenly the drums broke out again in a river of hurrying notes. There was a great shout. The dancers rushed forward, picked up the snakes, and ran out of the square. Men, women, children, all the crowd ran after them. A minute later, the square was empty. Only the boy remained, flat on his face where he had fallen, quite still. 3 old women came out of one of the houses, and, with some difficulty, lifted him and carried him in. The bird and the man on the cross kept guard for a little while over the empty square. Then, as though they had seen enough, sank slowly down below the ground, out of sight, into the lower world. Lenina was still crying. "Too awful," she kept repeating. "Too awful, that blood." She trembled violently. "Oh, I wish I had my Soma." There was the sound of feet in the inner room. Lenina sat without moving, her face buried in her hands. Only Bernard turned round. The dress of the young man who now came towards them was Indian, but his hair was yellow, his eyes a pale blue, and his skin a white skin, although sunburnt. "Hello. Good day," said the stranger, in correct but odd English. "You're civilized, aren't you? You come from the other place, outside the reservation?" "Who on earth?" Bernard began in surprise. The young man shook his head. "A most unhappy gentleman," and pointing to the blood in the centre of the square. "Do you see that?" he asked in a voice that trembled with emotion. "Oh, I wish I had my Soma," cried Lenina from behind her hands. "I ought to have been there," the young man went on. "Why wouldn't they let me be the sacrifice? I'd have gone round 10 times, 12, 15. Palo Witiwa only got as far as 7. They could have had twice as much blood from me, enough to turn the seas red." He threw his arms out wide, then let them fall again in hopelessness. "But they won't let me. They dislike me for the color of my skin. It's always been like that. Always. Tears stood in the young man's eyes. He was ashamed and turned away. The shock made Lenina forget all about her soma. She took her hands away from her face and, for the first time, looked at the stranger. "Do you mean to say that you wanted to be hit with that whip?" The young man nodded. "For the sake of the village, to make the rain come and the corn grow, and to please Pukong and Jesus, and then to show that I can bear pain without crying out. Yes!" And his voice suddenly grew firmer. He turned to her, lifting his head proudly. "To show that I'm a man. Oh!" He drew in his breath sharply and was silent, staring. He had seen, for the first time in his life, the face of a girl whose cheeks were not the colour of chocolate or dogskin, whose hair was golden and beautiful, and who looked at him kindly, something he was not used to. Lenina was smiling at him. Such a nice-looking boy, she was thinking, and a really beautiful body. The blood rushed up into the young man's face. He dropped his eyes, raised them again for a moment, only to find her still smiling at him, and was so full of new, strange feelings that he had to turn away and pretend to be looking very hard at something on the other side of the square. Bernard broke in with a number of questions. Who? How? When? Keeping his eyes fixed on Bernard's face, for his desire to see Lenina smiling was so strong that he simply dared not look at her, the young man tried to explain himself. Linda and he, Linda was his mother, the word made Lenina look uncomfortable, were strangers in the reservation. Linda had come from the other place long ago, before he was born, with a man who was his father. Bernard listened eagerly. She had gone walking alone in those mountains over there to the north, had fallen down a steep place and hurt her head. Go on, said Bernard excitedly. Some hunters from Malpais had found her and brought her to the village. As for the man who was his father, Linda had never seen him again. His name was Tomakin. Yes, Thomas was the DHC's first name. He must have flown away, back to the other place, away without her. A bad, unkind, unnatural man. And so I was born in Malpais, he ended. In Malpais. And he shook his head. The ugliness of that little house on the edge of the village. A space of dust and rubbish separated it from the village. 2 hungry dogs were pushing their noses hungrily into the rubbish at its door. Inside, when they entered, the air smelt strongly and it was loud with flies. Linda, the young man called. From the inner room, a woman's voice said thickly, Coming! They waited. In bowls on the floor were the remains of a meal, perhaps of several meals. The door opened. A very large, yellow-haired woman came in and stood staring at the strangers, her mouth wide open in surprise. Lenina noticed with horror that 2 of the front teeth were missing, and the colour of the ones that remained, she could hardly look. So fat, and the loose hanging cheeks all rough and purple, and all the lines in her face, and the blood marks on her nose and in her eyes, and that neck, and the cloth she wore over her head, torn and dirty, and under the brown cloth that she wore over her body, those enormous breasts, the great round stomach. Oh, much worse than the old man, much worse. And suddenly the creature burst into a flood of speech, rushed at her with her arms stretched out, and Ford, it was too horrible. In another moment she'd be sick. Held Lenina tightly to her fat body and began to kiss her. Ford! Such wet kisses, and she smelt too horrible, obviously never had a bath. And she had been drinking some very strong alcohol. Lenina broke free as quickly as she could. A twisted face stared at her. The creature was crying. "Oh, my dear, if you only knew how glad, after all these years, a civilized face, yes, and civilized clothes, because I thought I should never see a piece of real artificial silk again. And those lovely shorts. Do you know, dear, I've still got my old clothes, the ones I came in, put away in a box. I'll show them to you afterwards, though, of course, the cloth has all gone into holes. I suppose John has told you what I had to suffer, and not a gram of soma to be had, only a drink of mescal every now and then, when Popeye used to bring it. Popeye is a boy I used to know, but it makes you feel so bad afterwards, the mescal does, and sick. Besides, it always made that awful feeling of being ashamed much worse the next day. And I was so ashamed. Just think of it, me, a beater, having a baby. Put yourself in my place." The mere suggestion made Lenina tremble. "Though it wasn't my fault, I swear I still don't know how it happened, because I did all that I was supposed to, but all the same, it happened." She drew a deep breath, shook her head, opened her eyes again, then blew her nose on her fingers and wiped them on her skirt. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, seeing Lenina's look of disgust. "I oughtn't to have done that. But what are you to do here?" Linda shook her head. "I tried to tell them about disease and about keeping things clean when I first came here, but they didn't understand. And in the end, I suppose I got used to it. And anyhow, how can you keep things clean when there isn't any running hot water? And look at these clothes. This horrible wool isn't like artificial material. It never wears out. It lasts and lasts, and you're supposed to mend it if it gets torn. But I'm a beater. I worked in the fertilizing room. Nobody ever taught me to do anything like that. It wasn't my business. Besides, it never used to be right to mend clothes. Throw them away when they've got holes in them and buy new. The more stitches, the less riches. But it's all different here. It's like living with mad people. Everything they do is mad." She lowered her voice. "Take the way they have one another here. Mad, I tell you, absolutely mad. Everyone belongs to everyone else, don't they?" she whispered, pulling at Lenina's arm. Lenina nodded and turned her head away from the smell of Linda's breath. "Well, here," the other went on, "nobody's supposed to belong to more than one person. If you have people in the ordinary way, the others think you're bad. Once, a lot of women came and shouted at me because their men came to see me. Well, why not? And then they rushed at me. No, it was too awful. I can't tell you about it. Linda covered her face with her hands and cried. They're so hateful here, the women. Mad, mad and cruel. And of course, they don't know anything about bottles or contraceptives. So they're having children all the time, like dogs. It's too disgusting. And to think that oh, Ford. And yet John was a great comfort to me. I don't know what I should have done without him, even though he did get so upset whenever a man, quite as a tiny boy even, once, but that was when he was bigger, he tried to kill poor Waihu Siwa, or was it Pope? Just because I used to have them sometimes. Because I never could make him understand that that's what civilized people ought to do. Being mad's catching, I believe. Anyhow, John seems to have caught it from the Indians, because, of course, he was with them a lot. Even though they were so unkind to him and wouldn't let him do all the things the other boys did, which was a good thing in a way, because it made it easier for me to condition him a little. Though you've no idea how difficult that is. There's so much one doesn't know. It wasn't my business to know. I mean, when a child asks you how a helicopter works, or who made the world, well, what are you to answer if you're a beta and have always worked in the fertilizing room? What are you to answer? Chapter 8. John. Outside, in the dust and among the rubbish, there were 4 dogs now. Bernard and John were walking slowly up and down. So hard for me to realize, Bernard was saying, to put it all together, as though we were living in different worlds, in different centuries. A mother, and all this dirt, and gods, and old age, and disease. He shook his head. It's almost unbelievable. I shall never understand unless you explain. Explain what? This. He pointed to the village. That. And it was the little house outside the village. Everything, all your life. But what is there to say? From the beginning, as far back as you can remember. As far back as I can remember. John thought deeply. There was a long silence. It was very hot. They had eaten a lot of bread and vegetables. Linda said, "Come and lie down, baby." They lay down together in the big bed. Sing. And Linda sang, nursery songs. Her voice grew fainter and fainter. There was a loud noise, and he woke suddenly. A man was standing by the bed, enormous, frightening. He was saying something to Linda, and Linda was laughing. She had pulled the bedclothes up to her chin, but the man pulled them down again. His hair was like 2 black ropes, and round his arm was a lovely silver band with blue stones in it. He liked the band, but all the same he was frightened. He hid his face against Linda's body. Linda put her hand on him, and he felt safer. In those other words he did not understand so well, she said to the man, "Not with John here." But the man took hold of one of his arms, and it hurt. He screamed. The man put out his other hand and lifted him up. Linda held him, saying, "No, no!" The man said something short and angry. He kicked and struggled, but the man carried him across to the door, opened it, put him down on the floor in the middle of the other room, and went away, shutting the door behind him. He got up, he ran to the door. Standing on the tips of his toes, he could just reach the big wooden handle. He turned it and pushed, but the door wouldn't open. "Linda!" he shouted. She didn't answer. He remembered a huge room, rather dark, and there were big wooden things with strings tied to them, and lots of women standing round them, making cloth, Linda said. Linda told him to sit in the corner with the other children while she went and helped the women. He played with the little boys for a long time. Suddenly, people started talking very loudly, and there were the women pushing Linda away, and Linda was crying. She went to the door, and he ran after her. He asked her why they were angry. "Because I broke something," she said, and then she got angry too. "How should I know how to do their stupid weaving?" she said. "Horrible savages!" He asked her what savages were. When they got back to their house, Popeye was waiting at the door, and he came in with them. He had a big bottle full of stuff that looked like water, but it wasn't water. It was something with a bad smell that burnt your mouth and made you cough. Linda drank some, and Popeye drank some, and then Linda laughed a lot and talked very loudly, and then she and Popeye went into the other room. When Popeye went away, he went into the room. Linda was in bed and so fast asleep that he couldn't wake her. Popeye used to come often. He said the stuff in the bottle was called mescal, but Linda said it ought to be called soma, only it made you feel ill afterwards. He hated Popeye. He hated them all the men who came to see Linda. One afternoon, when he had been playing with the other children, it was cold, he remembered, and there was snow on the mountains. He came back to the house and heard angry voices in the bedroom. They were women's voices, and they said words he didn't understand, but he knew they were bad words. Then suddenly, crash! Something fell over. He heard people moving about quickly, and there was another crash, and then a noise of someone being hit. Then Linda screamed, "Oh, don't! Don't!" He ran in. There were 3 women in dark clothes. Linda was on the bed. One of the women was holding her wrists. Another was lying across her legs so that she couldn't kick. The third was hitting her with a whip. Once, twice, 3 times, and each time Linda screamed. Crying, he caught hold of the woman's brown hand and bit it as hard as he could. She cried out, pulled her hand free, and gave him such a push that he fell down. While he was lying on the ground, she hit him 3 times with the whip. It hurt more than anything he had ever felt, like fire. "But why did they want to hurt you?" he asked that night. "I don't know. How should I know? They say those men are their men." And she burst into tears. He pressed against her. He put his arm round her neck. Linda cried out, "Oh, be careful, my shoulder, oh!" And she pushed him away hard. His head knocked against the wall painfully. "Stupid boy!" she shouted, and then suddenly she began to hit him. "Linda!" he cried out. "Oh, Mother, don't!" "I'm not your mother. I won't be your mother. Turned into a savage," she shouted. having young ones like an animal. If I hadn't had you, I might have gone to the inspector. I might have got away, but not with a baby. That would have been too shameful." He saw that she was going to hit him again and lifted his arm to protect his face. "Oh, don't! Linda, please don't!" He shut his eyes, expecting the blow, but she didn't hit him. After a little time, he opened his eyes and saw that she was looking at him. He tried to smile at her. Suddenly, she put her arms round him and kissed him again and again. The happiest times were when she told him about the other place, how you could go flying whenever you liked, and how you could have music out of a box, and about the other boxes where you could see and hear what was happening at the other side of the world, and babies in lovely clean bottles, everything so clean, no smells and no dirt at all, and people never lonely, but living together and being happy all the time. Sometimes, when he and the other children were tired with too much playing, one of the old men of the village would tell them strange stories of the gods and of the beginning of the world. Strange stories that he did not fully understand. Lying in bed later, he would think of heaven and London and rows of clean bottles and Jesus and Linda flying up and the great director of world production and R. Ford himself. The boys said bad things about Linda and about the men who came to see her. Sometimes they laughed at him for being such a mess. When he tore his clothes, Linda did not know how to mend them. In the other place, she told him, people threw away clothes with holes in them and got new ones. But Linda taught him to read, drawing pictures and letters on the wall with the point of a burnt stick. And when the other boys shouted at him, he said to himself, "But I can read, and they can't. They don't even know what reading is." When he could read well enough, Linda gave him a thin little book that she had kept in a box with her clothes from the other place. It was a book of instructions for beta embryo store workers, telling them what chemicals to use for various processes in the treatment of the bottled embryos. Soon he could read all the words quite well, even the longest. But what did they mean? He asked Linda, but even when she could answer, it didn't seem to make it very clear, and generally she couldn't answer at all. "What are chemicals?" he would ask. "Oh, different kinds of salts for making bones develop, and solutions for keeping the deltas and epsilons small and unintelligent, and all that sort of thing." "But how do you make chemicals, Linda? Where do they come from?" "Well, I don't know. You get them out of bottles, and when the bottles are empty, you send up to the chemical store for more. It's the chemical store people who make them, I suppose. Or else they send to the factory for them. I don't know. I never did any chemistry. My job was with the embryos." It was the same with everything else he asked about. Linda never seemed to know. The old men of the village had much more definite answers about how the world began. One day, John thought it must have been soon after his 12th birthday, he came home and found a book that he had never seen before lying on the floor in the bedroom. It was a thick book and looked very old. The binding had been eaten by mice. Some of its pages were loose or torn. He picked it up and looked at the title page. The book was called The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Linda was lying on the bed, drinking that horrible-smelling mescal out of a cup. "Popey brought the book," she said. "He found it in an old chest in the corner of the Temple of the Gods. It's supposed to have been there for hundreds of years. I expect it's true because I looked at it and it seemed to be full of nonsense. Uncivilized. Still, it'll be good enough for you to practice your reading on," she continued in a thick, drunken voice. She took a last drop, set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, turned over on her side, and fell into a deep sleep. He began to read. The strange words rolled through his mind like talking thunder, like the drums at the summer dances, if the drums could have spoken, like the men singing the corn song, beautiful, beautiful so that you cried, like old Mitsima saying magic over his feathers and his sticks and his bits of bone and stone, but better than Mitsima's magic, because it talked to him. He could only half understand the words, but they were full of a beautiful and terrible magic. When he was 15, Mitsima taught him the art of making water pots. His first pot was so badly made that it leaned over to one side. "But the next one will be better," he said to himself, and began to shape another piece of clay. He learned to love the work. He found an extraordinary pleasure in making things with his hands and in learning every time to do them better. They worked all day, side by side on the riverbank, singing as they sat there making pots. "Next winter," said old Mitsima, "I will teach you to make a bow and arrows." When boys reached 16, at the time of the full moon, they would go into the temple where secrets were told to them, and they would come out men. At last it was the day when he should go in his turn. The sun went down, the moon rose. He went with the others. Men were standing, dark shapes, at the entrance to the temple. A ladder went down into a big opening below, where a red light shone. Already the leading boys had begun to climb down. Suddenly one of the men stepped forward, caught him by the arm, and pulled him out. He broke free and ran back to his place among the others. This time the man struck him, pulled his hair. "Not for you, White Hair." "Not for the son of the she-dog," said one of the other men. The boys laughed. "Go." And as he still waited, standing on the edge of the group, "Go!" the men shouted again. One of them bent down, took a stone, threw it. "Go! Go! Go!" There was a shower of stones. Bleeding, he ran away into the darkness. From the red-lit hole in the ground came the sound of singing. The last of the boys had climbed down the ladder. He was alone. All alone outside the village on the empty plain. The rock looked like white bones in the moonlight. Down in the valley, wild dogs cried at the moon. His body hurt, the cuts were still bleeding, but it was not for pain that he cried. It was because he was all alone, because he had been driven out into this empty world of stone and moonlight. At the edge of a high rock he sat down. The moon was behind him. He looked down into the black shadow of death. He had only to take one step, one little jump. He held out his right hand in the moonlight. From the cut on his wrist, the blood was still flowing gently. Every few seconds a drop fell, dark, almost colourless in the dead light. Drop, drop, drop. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. He had discovered time, and death, and God. Alone, always alone, the young man was saying. The words awoke a sad memory in Bernard. Alone, alone. So am I, he said in a sudden desire to share his feelings with someone else. Terribly alone. Are you? John looked surprised. I thought that in the other place, Linda always said that nobody was ever alone there. Bernard reddened uncomfortably. You see, he said almost in a whisper, turning his eyes aside in shame. I'm rather different from most people, I suppose. If something happens to one's treatment and one comes out of the bottle different... Yes, that's just it, the young man nodded. If one's different, one's certain to be lonely. They're very cruel to one. Do you know, they shut me out of absolutely everything. When the other boys were sent out to spend the night on the mountains, you know, when you have to dream which your holy animal is, they wouldn't let me go with the others. They wouldn't tell me any of the secrets. I did it by myself, though, he added. Didn't eat anything for 5 days and then went out alone into those mountains there. He pointed. Bernard smiled a little smile of pity at the ignorance and simplicity of the young man. And did you dream of anything? He asked. The other nodded. But I mustn't tell you what. They fell silent for a while. Then Bernard said, I wonder if you'd like to come back to London, taking the first step in a plan which he had decided to carry out ever since, in the little house, he had realized who the father of this young savage must be. Would you like that? The young man's face lit up. Do you really mean it? Of course. If I can get permission from the World Controller, that is. Linda too? Well... He paused doubtfully. That horrible creature. No, it was impossible. Unless... It suddenly occurred to Bernard that her very ugliness might be enormously useful. But of course, he cried, making up for his first uncertainty with a show of great pleasure. The young man drew a deep breath. How amazing that it's coming true! What I've dreamt of all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who's Miranda? His eyes shone and his face was full of bright colour. You know, Shakespeare's Miranda. She says how beautiful the world is, and the people in it. The colour suddenly grew deeper. He was thinking of Lenina, of a heavenly creature in bottle-green clothes, shining with youth and skin food, beautifully rounded in shape, sweetly smiling. Oh, brave new world, he began, then suddenly stopped and turned pale. Are you married to her? He asked. Am I what? Married. You know, forever. They say forever in the Indian words. It can't be broken. Ford, no. Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason. He laughed for pure joy. Oh, brave new world, he repeated. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once. You have the strangest way of talking sometimes, said Bernard, staring at the young man in surprise. And anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world?